Hey folks, today in preparation for reading The Red Badge of Courage, we are going to learn about the Battle of Chancellorsville. It's an important battle. I would have talked about it anyway, but I don't know that I would have given it a full lecture. Today I'm giving it a full lecture just to give you some background. The Red Badge of Courage is kind of fun because it's the first thing we're going to see that's told sort of from the soldier's perspective. It's told from the perspective of a common soldier, somebody without rank. But in order to understand, I think, what's going on in that, you kind of have to understand the overarching uh, movements and what's going on in the battle. It helps you appreciate the novel in a way that you don't if you don't understand what conflict it's really about. So, the Battle of Chancellorsville, really important battle, sort of the high water mark of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and the fights that he had with the Union. It took place April 30th through May 5th, 1863, just prior to the Gettysburg campaign. It was four engagements generally that we call the Battle of Chancellorsville. There was Jackson's flank attack, followed by the actual battle around Chancellorsville, followed by Second Fredericksburg, and the Battle of Salem Church. They all happened within a 5-day period, and it was they were all related. They were all the same armies in the same maneuvering and those sorts of things. So sometimes when you hear people talk about Chancellorsville, they're just talking about sort of that central battle. Sometimes that central battle with the flank attack included, and sometimes about all of them. But I think it's important that you understand all of them. So where does this occur? Because most people don't have a good idea of where Chancellorsville is. Partially because Chancellorsville sounds like this big town, like Fredericksburg or something, but it's really just one house in which the Chancellor family lived. The house is burned down as a result of the battle, and now the ruins are there, but it's really just a foundation. It's kind of cool. We might be able to go and see it and look at it. But you can see it there. You can see Warrenton at the top of the map and Culpeper, and you can see Manassas on the map as well. And Chancellorsville is sort of down there, near Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg, of course, being that big battle that Burnside lost last time we were talking. So the Union situation, we'll start out with the Union situation just to give you an idea. You can see that the Union Army was situated just north of the Rappahannock River across from Fredericksburg, exactly where Burnside left it after his defeat against Lee at Fredericksburg, and then his mud march didn't go anywhere and he had to return to winter quarters. So the Army spent the winter there getting reinforced. It continued to get bigger and bigger. They had 130,000 men at the outset of this campaign to Lee's 60,000 men, so they more than doubled his number. Also, the Union soldiers had eaten well over the winter. They had good equipment. They had continued to train, and Lee's men did not have all of those advantages. They were badly supplied. They were starving. Scurvy was sort of rampant. Scurvy is a disease you get from malnourishment. We'll talk about it later. But the big news was that Ambrose Burnside, there he is with his one. I mean, how can you be named Burnside and have sideburns like that? But whatever. He's out. He after his terrible decisions at the engagement of Fredericksburg to charge uphill against impossible odds and lose men. He was in disgrace, and his soldiers didn't like him, and his generals had lost confidence in him. Ultimately, he asked Lincoln to court-martial a bunch of generals who were becoming insubordinate, most importantly, a guy named Hooker, who hated him. Actually, funny story. When McClellan was fired and Lincoln offered Burnside the job, Burnside had initially turned it down, but when Lincoln told him that his second choice was Hooker, Burnside was like, never mind, I'll take it. I hate that guy. And so Burnside and Hooker hated each other even before Burnside ordered Hooker's regiment to charge up a hill into an absolutely invincible position and get obliterated. But Hooker was instrumental in sort of the coup that made Burnside give Lincoln this ultimatum. Burnside said to Lincoln, either you court-martial all these guys who have been working against me from within my army, or I resign. And Lincoln was like, okay, you resign. And so Burnside was out, and Hooker was in. It's kind of funny. Hooker, he's this mediocrity, really. There's this picture. I mean, he looks a little weird. He looks almost a little off balance, and that's maybe accurate. So his name was Joseph Hooker, and he He got this nickname Fighting Joe because of a typo in a newspaper. The newspaper said fighting, and then they wanted to have like this dash, this separator, like there's fighting, like was the headline, and then it was like Joseph Hooker and whatever he did. But they left out the dash by mistake, and so it just Fighting Joe Hooker, and then that like took off, and so he's been called Fighting Joe Hooker ever since, even though it was never intentional. And I think that added to his reputation and maybe added to him being able to get this job in sort of an interesting public relations way. Because he's not uniquely qualified. He was middle of his class in West Point. He fought in the Seminole War. He fought in the Mexican-American War, like so many of these guys. But he didn't do anything amazing. And then he resigned his commission and moved out to California and engaged in a bunch of risky business adventures that didn't earn him anything. And when the war started up again, he offered his services to Lincoln and was reinstated as a general. And that's sort of how he got his position. And he continued to fight pretty well and follow orders pretty well. And ultimately, because of the reputation, partially because of the mistake about his name, he was able to get the position after Burnside was fired. And so this is Fighting Joe Hooker. His second in command, this is the Union generals, and I think these are the ones that you need to know, was a guy named John Sedgwick. Actually, Hooker's going to take 80,000 infantry and artillery for his part. He's going to divide his army and do some interesting maneuvers, and we'll talk about the maneuvers in a second. But he's going to take the lion's share of the army, 80,000 infantry and artillery, and make a flanking movement on Lee. His second in command is a guy named John Sedgwick. I think he's in charge of the 4th Corps, and he was left with 26,000 infantry and artillery, and he's supposed to make a diversionary attack on Fredericksburg. Interestingly, he had been a major directly under Robert E. Lee in the Army before the outbreak of the Civil War, and so Robert E. Lee knew Sedgwick. Sedgwick's temperament was that he was kind of calm and controlled and didn't like taking risks, and Lee knew this, and he was able to use it to his advantage. In contrast, Fighting Joe Hooker was infamous for taking risks and being aggressive, also for drinking and womanizing. Apparently, in the Mexican-American War, he was referred to by the Spanish women, or the Mexican-American is kind of an awkward thing because Mexico was really a two-tier country at the time. There was this, and I don't know if this matters to anything, but I'm telling it to you anyway, because why not? But there was this aristocracy of essentially Spanish immigrants, and then there were all the natives, and so there were sort of two classes in the country, and the aristocracy were the rulers, they were also the generals, and anyway, all the Spanish descent women referred to him as the handsome captain, and apparently he had a good time down in Mexico. Anyway, John Sedgwick was the second in command. The only other guy on the Union side you really need to know is a guy named George Stoneman. He's a cavalry general, pretty famous cavalry general. He gets assigned a maneuver that ends up being important, but not for the way it was intended to be important, and so we'll talk about him in a second, but we're going to use his name a few times, so it's good to have sort of a mental image of him. So we got 130,000 men sitting on the north of the Rappahannock, right across from Fredericksburg, and there's a lot of pressure building on Fighting Joe Hooker to go fight. Part of it is Lincoln. Lincoln hired Hooker specifically because he wanted a general who would attack the enemy instead of a general like McClellan who would not. The politicians were pushing for fight. The press, or their On to Richmond slogan, was continuing to press for more attacks, more advance. And so there was a lot of pressure on Hooker to plan and lead an attack against Lee. Also, there was a danger because the anti-war movement was gaining momentum in the North, and that was Lee's best hope for a successful end to the war. The Union Army was continually reinforced and re-equipped. It was growing and gaining in strength, and his army was dwindling. He had a lot of desertion over the winter because of the lack of food. He was not getting reinforcements. He was not getting equipment. The naval blockade was strangling the South, and so he could hope to get weaker, and he could watch the North get stronger, and so he needed a resolution to this fight, and his best resolution was that the North would get sick of battle, and that was what they were hoping for. And the anti-war movement was gaining momentum, and Hooker had to get some victories to satisfy people and have them think that a positive outcome was still possible for the war. In addition, there were some year and a half enlistments that were up in April, May, and June. And so 35,000 of those Union soldiers were due to go home and be discharged. And Hooker had pressure to use those soldiers while he could before they were out of his army. So he came up with a plan. A pretty good plan, really, when you think about it. This is the plan. I've got sort of a graphic for you here. Hooker's plan was to divide his army. He was going to take 80,000 men and march sort of northwest. You can sort of see that arrow going northwest there. He was going to cross his men at a place called Kelly's Ford and march south and get on Lee's flank, get on his side, and threaten him. While he was doing that, or slightly before actually, about a week before he was doing that, he was going to dispatch Stoneman with all the cavalry, and the cavalry were going to make this wide and fast flanking maneuver and get behind Lee's position and cut off his retreat. They were going to cause damage and havoc, and maybe that would cause Lee to detach some men to go south and deal with them, and those men wouldn't be there for the battle, causing Lee to be outnumbered. Hooker had a lot of good reasons for what he did. They also made some special accommodations for the cavalry. The cavalry traditionally took its supplies and materials in wagon trains, and that limited them to traveling on roads, and the cavalry decided to use mules instead, because mules could travel anywhere and overland, and that would make them more mobile. Hooker, his job with his 28,000 men was to set up a diversionary attack on Fredericksburg. So he was going to put pontoon bridges across the river, march his men across, very much like Burnside did before, and line up looking like he was going to attack Fredericksburg, ideally to keep Lee there. And as Hooker saw it, Lee had a couple of choices. He could stay and defend Fredericksburg, in which case he would be trapped between that what Hooker called the hammer and the anvil. His 80,000 men were the hammer, and Sedgwick's men were the anvil. He would come in from the side, smash into... whoa, he didn't see that. Nope. Yeah, I thought it's all right. We'll go back to it. Smash into Lee's troops from the side, and Lee would be attacked from two sides, and then, his army would break. It was much smaller, and try and retreat. But as it was trying to retreat, it would get caught by the cavalry and decimated. And so Hooker's plan was to wipe out the entirety of Lee's army. The other option was that Lee would try and retreat, but if he tried to retreat, the cavalry would slow his retreat. Hooker would be able to merge with Sedgwick and follow Lee south and catch him between himself and the cavalry and thereby defeat him. So there's a change of tactics here, and I think this is an important change of tactics. It's actually a good idea on Hooker's part. Generals before this were seeking to take Richmond. They were going to take the southern capital and thereby force the South to surrender. Hooker decides that he's not messing with taking Richmond. He wants to destroy Lee's army. If he destroys Lee's army, he will be victorious. This is the same tactic that Grant is going to take when he takes command shortly. So it seems like a good plan. The problem is that it doesn't go actually. Fun fact, this is an actual quote from Hooker. He said of his plan, quote, "My plans are perfect, and when I start to carry them out, may God have mercy on Bobby Lee, for I shall have none." Kind of arrogant, but clearly the guy thought he was going to be successful. In fact, he's also quoted as saying he thought he had 80 chances in 100 of being successful. But there were problems from the start. Stoneman's cavalry went to cross the river, and there was a huge rainstorm. The river flooded, and they couldn't get across, and so they ended up waiting for over a week, and they finally crossed at the same time that Hooker's men crossed, and so the cavalry was behind schedule, and they didn't get behind the enemy lines the way they were supposed to. But also a problem with his plan was that he sent the cavalry south, which meant he didn't have any scouts. He didn't have the kinds of things that you would expect an army to have. Remember, armies use the cavalry as their intelligence gathering service. Hooker wasn't particularly worried about this because he had a hydrogen hot air balloon service that he used for aerial reconnaissance, and he felt like he could see the movements of the enemy very well that way. The other problem the cavalry had was the mules. The mules were supposed to make them more mobile and move faster, but it turns out that mules are stubborn as well. and mules. And so the mules would throw off their equipment, would refuse to move, would cause all kinds of problems. And so Stoneman's cavalry was way, way behind schedule and was not any kind of a factor in the battle the way that Hooker anticipated they would be. So let's look at the Confederate situation. The Confederates are facing a very dire, very desperate situation. They have 60,000 men against 130,000 men. They have less than half the troops that the North does. They're low on supplies, both in terms of ammunition and uniforms. You know, the cold winter was hard on them. They're malnourished. There's an outbreak of scurvy, which is a bone disease that you can get when you have other things are affected too, your internal organs and things like that. When you have not enough nourishment. In fact, the situation was so dire that one of the reasons that Lee's numbers are so low is that he sent one of his best generals, Longstreet, with I think 2 corps, down to southern Virginia to forage. So he was down there trying to gather as much food as he could, put it on wagons, and bring it back up to feed these armies when this battle is engaged. And if you recall, there are 3 great tacticians in the Army of Virginia. Lee is one of them. Stonewall Jackson is another, and James Longstreet is the third. And it's interesting because Jackson is a offensive strategist. He's brilliant at planning attacks and carrying them out. Longstreet was a defensive strategist. He came up with something called the inverse trench, which ended up being one of the primary inventions of the South in the war, and was the model for all World War I trenches. And he invented this and used it to great effect. Generally, whenever Longstreet was involved in a battle and was able to entrench his soldiers, the casualties were more than 2 to 1 in favor of his side versus the Union. But Hooker's plan was based on the idea that Lee was going to do what he expected Lee to do. Traditional military wisdom said if you have a smaller force, you don't divide it because the enemy can destroy it in detail. They can wipe it out even more easily. So you have to keep your force together. And if Lee's going to keep his force together, he can keep it at Fredericksburg or he can retreat. There's not much else he can do with it. But Lee is like, nah. He decides that he's going to divide his army. He leaves 12,000 men with Jubal Early to defend Fredericksburg. They're not enough. If Sedgwick launches an attack and outnumbers him more than 2 to 1, he's going to push Early off those heights and take it. But Lee knew Sedgwick. He refers to him still as quote-unquote Major Sedgwick in his aristocratic Southern way. And he knows that Sedgwick isn't going to launch an attack against superior ground, especially if it's the same ground that Burnside launched a horribly failed attack over just a year ago, or not even a year ago, 6 months ago. And so Lee is pretty secure that Early will be able to hold this territory with only 12,000 men. So he takes the other 48,000 men, and he marches to meet Fighting Joe Hooker, who he calls Mr. F.J. Hooker. His first initial is not F, but again, Lee has this sort of aristocratic, understated sense of humor, and he likes to poke fun at his enemies. And so he marches west very unexpectedly for Hooker. He had no idea that Lee was coming for him. And so this takes Hooker by surprise and gives Lee the initiative. So when Lee gets over there with his 48,000 men, he does something even more surprising. He's going to meet with Jackson, and they're going to decide to divide his force further. So Lee takes his numerically inferior army, and he divides it into 3 parts that maneuver separately. And theoretically, any one of them could be captured and destroyed in detail, which is something that you're afraid of if you're a general. Anyway, here's Robert E. Lee. I have not really talked about Lee's background and history, so I want to break to do that briefly. He's a really famous figure. There's a lot known about him, and I think it would be important for you to know a little bit of his history. So Robert E. Lee, the most famous general, arguably the most famous general of the Civil War, and arguably the second most recognizable figure of the Civil War, the first being Abraham Lincoln. So Robert E. Lee came from a family in the South, a Virginian family of English descent. In fact, his ancestors, this is kind of interesting, go back to the English Civil War. There was this big civil war in England between Parliament and the King. and the guys who defended the king followed the code of chivalry and considered themselves to be knights. The word for knights at the time was cavaliers. Oh no. None of this works, does it? All right.